Most of the time in other services, I would be reading from the Bible, Scripture, but that was our call to worship today. So as we begin in this time of, I'm going to suggest we think of it as contemplation, how did the story that we heard this morning from Luke end? As far as we heard this morning, what was the last part of the story? You got to remember, the women went back to the apostles and the others, it said. But what was the apostles' response to what the women said? They were confused. They didn't believe him. My friends, the story is still pretty hard to believe. And sometimes I'm not sure that it's even possible to be a lot more than confused about this Easter story. So in that sense, I found this little reading from a writer who is long since gone, but Basil Pennington. I don't know if any of you have ever read any of his things. He was a teacher of theology and a writer of some distinction from England. But for me, these words explain what it is that all of us do together every time we meet for worship, and there's this thing called a sermon. So it doesn't talk about sermons, but let me read this before we go on and deliberate today. It is contemplation that leads us most powerfully into compassion. It is true that because of the solidarity of the human race and the more profound oneness of those baptized in Christ, whenever any one of us rises through contemplation to new levels of consciousness, the whole human family is raised. Any bit of leaven will leaven the entire mass. Now, how many of you are gardeners of one sort or another? Uh-oh, I see somebody going, that means you were. Well, I'm not a gardener, but my wife will tell you that I like to grow things, okay? And I've got another idea this year for our forever home, the one we supposedly retired to, that I have another place to plant some stuff. And it's going to be the kind of stuff that it'll grow and it'll bloom. That's my favorite kind. You know, it grows and it gets fairly large and then it blooms. But I want to do it now. I wanted to do it yesterday. It was so nice yesterday, wasn't it? Well, and I've learned the hard way that I have to wait. Now, I could go even today or tomorrow and dig the area up where I want to plant these things. Right now, it's just full of weeds. And so I could dig it up and take the weeds and put them in the wheelbarrow and then dump them out someplace and prepare it. And I learned that if you put some of this little pellet stuff in, it'll keep more weeds from growing back. Yeah, preen, thank you, preen. I could do all that, but I still can't plant this stuff. Why? I have to wait till it's warm enough and it's not going to freeze again. That's like 2 or 3 weeks from now. Yeah. See, now you're making it worse. This is Easter. This is Easter. Don't do this to me. Seriously. I got to wait, and I don't like it. And then the doggone stuff takes forever, it seems, to grow. And then you read on the thing, the first year it may not bloom as well as in following years, and those kind of things. Well, you know, I still am going to do what I need to do it rightly. When I was preparing for ministry, I was very fortunate in that my last 2 years of seminary, I had a placement in a large United Church of Christ outside New Haven, Connecticut. And they really treated me as a part of the staff. So I got to do an awful lot of minister stuff. And I'll never forget when my mentor in ministry, Ed Lincoln, he would regularly meet with me, sometimes after a thing at the church, or he'd come to the seminary and we'd have lunch together and things. And he said, how's it going, You still sure you want to go into parish ministry? And I said, well, yeah, I think so, but boy, I hate those meetings. I still do, as any of you who know me well can attest. I don't like going to meetings. And it seemed at that time that that's most of what church life was. There was meeting after meeting after meeting, and ministers always had to be there. I couldn't stand meetings. And then there was also some other stuff, that you have to deal with that you don't really want to. Well, Ed looked at me, he said, yeah, that's never going to change. What do you like about ministry? I told him, and I still do, I like that it's got a built-in chance to help people. And it's a real privilege that people will come to you and tell you what's going on in their lives and share that with you and enable you sometimes to really help them. Okay? I liked that. I liked studying and doing the sermons and teaching adults and stuff. I still didn't like little kids back then. But no, seriously, I was always afraid I'd hurt them. But I told him what I liked, and he said, well, you got to understand, Dick, all that other stuff, those are your dues you have to pay to get to the good stuff. It wasn't that big a surprise to me that yet another, this time a professor in law school, 12 years later, said the very same thing to those of us who had been admitted into the trial law clinic. The guys that are going to go into the courtroom and try a case before a judge or a jury and that kind of stuff. And I liked that. I was already pretty good at it. But you should see what you have to do before you ever get to the courtroom. You got to file all these papers with the court. You got to read all these papers that the other side files with the court, even though you think none of it's true. And then you got to do more studying and more filing of papers. You got to talk to, and I'm sorry for any of you that work with insurance companies, but you got to talk to some insurance adjuster if it's an injury case or you're looking for money, who is probably 20 years or 30 years younger than you are, who's telling you, no, you can't have any money. You got to do all that stuff, and it takes years until finally you might, for 2 or 3 days, get to try the case in a courtroom. And most of the time, it's better for your clients if you settle the case. Do you understand that? Well, this guy who was the head of the trial law clinic, he said, you have to understand, he said exactly the same thing Ed Lincoln had said. You got to pay your dues before you get to go to court. And you better be really good at writing those briefs, and you better be really good at reading all the stuff you get, and you better be really good at putting an argument together before you ever walk in there. Those are the dues you pay to get to do what you want to do. Now, have you ever thought of this in all the Easter stories? And really, there's a little bit different in each of the Gospels. What if the women hadn't gone to the tomb? Now, did that ever occur to you? What if the women hadn't gone? Why did they go? Do you know why they went? Well, the body had been wrapped. They were going to put, it says in it's spices and all kinds of stuff. It was to keep it from smelling bad. And they had learned through the centuries, the people, that if you put certain kinds of things on dead bodies, they would still decay, but it wouldn't be so awful and everything. But why did they go to do that? Oh, you don't know. Yes, it was their job. That's what women did when there was a death. The women went and prepared the body for the tomb. Well, they didn't get to do that in this case, before, because what? What day was it when Jesus was laid in the tomb? What day would we call it of the week? Saturday. And what's that for Jews? No, well, yeah, it's a Sabbath. It's a day of preparation and everything like this. You aren't allowed to do any work on that day. So they had to wait till the next day, which was the first day of the week, which is Sunday, before they could go do it. That's why they went to the tomb. That's what they were supposed to do. You see how that's sort of like paying their dues? If they hadn't done it, would there even be an Easter story? Well, somebody had to start the story. And in every case, it's the women. It's the women who in those days were second-class citizens, who were easy to not listen to. The men thought they were just nuts. You know, what kind of a crazy story is that? Think if they hadn't done what they were used to doing, which they didn't argue about. Now, wait a minute. I thought I almost forgot something. I wanted to ask you, how many of you think that women in those days enjoyed doing this stuff? Now, what did they have to work with? A dead body. And in this case, I hate to tell you, but it was a dead body that had been dead for 2.5 days. How many of you have ever been around a dead body that hadn't had anything done to it for 2.5 days? It's not very nice. So the women, they were doing this because it was their duty. They were expected to do it. It wasn't any fun. They were paying their dues as human beings, as faithful Jewish women. But we do have the story, don't we? What did happen back then? What is the resurrection? That's why I read that thing from Basil Pennington. It seems to have nothing to do. But he talked about how we're going to spend some time in contemplation on purpose as part of the faithful life. And he said, remember that if you contemplate, that'll raise your ability to be, remember what the word was? Compassionate. And his belief that if even one person becomes a little bit more compassionate today, then all of humanity is that much more compassionate. That's what we're doing every time we have a sermon. We're trying to discuss it together and contemplate what it means. None of us is old enough to have been at the tomb that first Easter. There is not a human being on the face of the earth who was there on that first Easter. All we have are the stories that it happened, resurrection. So what is it that we get from Easter? What is it? I mean, what's resurrection? A restoring of life to a dead person. Can we all agree on that? It's at least that, okay? At least in the stories it is. What did it change? What did it change? Think about that just real quickly. It didn't change anything. All it proved was you can't kill the life of Christ. Now that's really something. But we already had that before the resurrection, didn't we? The life of Christ was 3 years. That's all it was 3 years of public ministry. And we keep telling the stories of that. Why do we do it? Because we know that there's truth to it, don't we? But even more than truth, there's something else. And this is what the importance of the resurrection was and still is. It's power. I mean, if you just think of it as the power over death, wow. That's the power of life, isn't it? That's really great. But you can't kill the life of Christ. You can't do it. That's what the resurrection reminds us of. And every one of us can experience the power of that life. Now, resurrection is not something that we inherit or that's given to us, okay? It's not some kind of a commodity that we can walk out of here with and do something with. It's a reminder that we already had Christ before the resurrection, but it's also a reminder that the power of the life of Christ is so great that you cannot kill it. We have to be able to pay our dues too if we want to experience that power of a life that can never die. It might be years before we have anybody who comes back to us and tells us what a difference our feeding ministries made in either their life or their family's life. Do you realize that? It might be a long time before we actually see or get told about what an amazing thing those simple meals we're doing on Thursday nights did for somebody or some family. So if we don't hear anything that amazing for the first 6 months, or let's say the first 12 months, are we going to stop? Are we going to stop? But where's the reward? You see? But I can guarantee you one thing. Someday we'll hear that it made a big difference because we did it. That's a form, you see, of paying dues. We're going to keep on keeping on, as Eldridge Cleaver said back in the 1960s. Keep on keeping on. We're going to be faithful. I know a lot of you are teachers. How many of you have had the experience of a now grown-up child who comes back to see you years after they've been out of your life to tell you what a difference you made for them? Or how many of you did that for a teacher? You went back and told them. If you've had that happen, all the teachers I know that have had that happen couldn't believe who it was that came and said that to them. They had no idea they were making that big a difference in that child's life. But I think they knew the whole time they were trying with every child that they were teaching, the whole time they were doing that, there was always the chance that they were. Don't you think? Teachers pay their dues all the time. I don't mean to the Michigan Education Association. They pay the dues all the time because they go every day and offer themselves and what they have to give to those kids. And sometimes they never know how much good they've been doing. If they quit, the only thing we know is there will be no good being done. It happens to pastors once in a while, too. That somebody will come years after we've left some church, but we run into them someplace else, and they say, remember when you did this or you said that? And sometimes you don't even remember. But for that person, it made all the difference for the rest of their life. And you didn't know what happened because you were just paying your dues. You were doing that which you had said yes to. And you kept doing it because somehow you knew there was some good in it. Do you know how much difference it could make to people who at least one time a week they know they're going to get a good meal? I doubt that very many of us know what that's like. I don't think very many of us know what that's like. Because most of us, I think all of us, pretty much know we're going to have a decent meal every time we want one. We have the means to do that. But sometimes for people, it's not that issue. It's that human beings weren't made to be alone all the time. And so sometimes people will come to our meals, and what they'll get is some kind of human companionship. They could go buy a meal any place they needed to. But the human companionship, you can't buy that. And that'll make a lot of difference in their life. And we won't know it. We won't know it because maybe we don't have to live through that. Can you imagine how much good you can do? Can you imagine how much good you can do if you keep putting yourself into situations and places where good can be done? Was it Robert Frost that said that thing about fences make good neighbors? You remember that line? I think it was Robert Frost, who was, by the way, a really mean SOB. He really was a bad human being. But anyway, that's the way Americans live. That fences make very good neighbors. So we have learned how to not have other people around to bother us quite a bit. In Michigan, that's pretty easy to do still. There's a lot of land around here. We have to work to put ourselves into situations and places where we have a chance to help people, or it's not going to happen. So we put ourselves into a church that has declared that mission is its only reason for being, and it's going to feed people once a week, and it's going to tutor kids once a week. You see, that's putting ourselves into a position, a situation, that we can do good, but there's no promise that at any given day, hour, meal, tutoring session, that we're going to know we did any good at all. I mean, you think I'm kidding, don't you, when I say that every time I get done tutoring at the school and the kids walk out without having been hurt, that I think I did a good job? Well, I'm not kidding about that so much, but seriously, if we're willing to pay the dues, if we're willing to commit ourselves and to on purpose put ourselves into positions of some vulnerability. I mean, after all, we're offering ourselves, our time, our skills, our compassion, and we might not ever be thanked for it. If we keep putting ourselves there because we've been led there by the one who you can't kill, the one whose life always said, "Come and follow me." And he showed us that love, the kind where you give yourself away to others, is the most powerful thing in the world. More powerful than bombs or bombers or bullets or baseball bats. More powerful than words. More powerful than anything. All we have to do is commit ourselves to being in those situations where Jesus is risen. He's risen indeed. Those with ears to hear, let them hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.